Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. It started like any other Tuesday morning. I got up at 6, showered, and made my way to the kitchen. The coffee machine whirred softly as I leaned against the counter, the familiar smell of freshly brewed espresso filling the room. I ran through the day's schedule in my mind, meetings at the firm, a conference call with a client, and an evening run if I could squeeze it in. Just another day. Normal, uncomplicated. But life has a funny way of letting you know when it's about to fall apart. I remember standing there absent-mindedly flipping through a stack of mail Sarah had left on the counter. Most of it was junk, coupons, credit card offers, and bills. Then I found it, a small crumpled receipt for the Grand Meridian Hotel. A pang of confusion shot through me. We'd never stayed there. Why would Sarah? The receipt itself was inconspicuous. Just a date 3 weeks ago and an amount I knew neither of us could justify spending on a single night. I stared at the slip of paper, feeling the first prickle of unease crawl up my spine. It was ridiculous, really, just a piece of paper. But that single receipt changed everything. A seed of suspicion took root in my mind, twisting and spreading its roots until I couldn't ignore it. I pocketed the receipt, more out of reflex than intention, and tried to shake off the unease as I finished my coffee. By the time I left for work, the paper was a crumpled ball in my fist, my grip tightening around it as if crushing it could crush the doubts gnawing at me. But the doubt didn't go away. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on anything. Not the project deadlines piling up on my desk or the incessant chatter of my colleagues. All I could think about was that damn receipt. I'd never felt this uncertainty before. Our marriage had been stable, hadn't it? Sure, we had our arguments like any other couple, but nothing earth-shattering. Nothing that should lead to secrets. When I got home that evening, I tried to act normal. Sarah was in the living room, sprawled out on the couch, flipping through her phone. The sight of her, so nonchalant and familiar, made me feel foolish. But there was something about her posture that seemed off, a slight stiffness in her shoulders, an almost imperceptible flinch when she noticed me watching her. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "Hey," she replied, her voice just a touch too casual. "How was work?" "Same old," I said, shrugging off my jacket. "Anything interesting today?" She shook her head. "Not really, just ran some errands, did some shopping." "Shopping?" I echoed, my gaze flickering to the counter. There were no new bags or boxes. No evidence of her having been anywhere but home. "Yeah, just a few things." She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "You know how it is." The conversation died, awkwardness settling between us like a fog. I could feel the tension coiling in the air, and it took every ounce of restraint not to pull the receipt from my pocket and demand an explanation. But what would that accomplish? If she had something to hide, she'd only lie about it. And if I was wrong, if this was all just a misunderstanding, I'd look like a paranoid fool. The days that followed were a blur of mounting anxiety. Every glance, every word exchange felt heavy with hidden meanings. Sarah's absences became more frequent. Going out with friends or running errands had become her standard answers. Each time she left, I felt a pang of suspicion that gnawed at me long after she was gone. I tried to push it all away to convince myself that I was overreacting. But then the signs started piling up. Unanswered texts, calls going straight to voicemail, and the small changes that only someone who truly paid attention would notice. Her smile was tighter, her laughter hollow. And then there were the new clothes. Expensive items that I knew she hadn't bought with our joint account. One evening I found myself alone in the house, staring at her laptop. The same laptop she'd always left lying around before. But recently it was as if she had started guarding it with her life. She would shut it down the moment I walked into the room, her fingers snapping the lid shut with practiced ease. Heart pounding, I opened the lid and was immediately confronted by a password prompt. My hands trembled as I tried our anniversary date, her mother's birthday, even her favorite pet's name. Nothing worked. I slammed the lid shut, the sound echoing in the silence of the empty house. She'd changed the password. Why? I knew I should talk to her, confront her directly. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way she'd been looking at me lately, eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. Or maybe it was the fear that if I asked, she'd tell me the truth, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. Instead, I started watching, not in an overt, creepy way, just noticing, like when she suddenly had to run out at 9 p.m. on a Friday night, or when she canceled our dinner plans for the third time in 2 weeks. I'd offer to come with her, and she'd get defensive, brushing me off with excuses that sounded rehearsed, forced. I started driving by the places she said she'd be. A restaurant one night, the gym another, but she was never there. The lies were so blatant, so effortlessly woven into our everyday conversations that I began to question everything. If she could lie so easily about these little things, what else had she been lying about? It was around this time that I began to notice other things too. The missed calls on her phone from numbers I didn't recognize. The late-night texts that made her lips twitch into a small, secretive smile. One night, I overheard her murmuring into her phone, her voice low and urgent. "I can't talk now. No, he's home." My blood ran cold. He? Who the hell was he? I'd never felt more helpless. Standing there in the hallway, straining to catch every word, I realized how far apart we drifted. How blind I'd been. Our marriage wasn't just in trouble. It was broken, shattered into pieces I hadn't even realized existed. I kept telling myself I'd confront her soon, that I'd get answers, but each time I tried, I found myself hesitating, unwilling to cross that line. So instead, I buried myself in work, in distractions, in anything that would keep me from facing the reality of what I already knew deep down. Sarah was hiding something, and whatever it was going to destroy us. The moment of clarity came 2 weeks later. I was tidying up when I found it. Another hotel receipt, same hotel, same room number. But this time there was no mistaking the dates. They lined up perfectly with one of her girls' nights out. I sank into a chair, staring at the slip of paper as if it could somehow give me answers. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. It was real. All the suspicions, the doubts, they were all true. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the walls closing in around me. This wasn't just a bad dream I could wake up from. This was my life now, unraveling before my eyes. Sarah was cheating. And I was the fool who'd let it happen. By the end of that night, I knew one thing for certain. I had to know the truth. No more guessing, no more assuming. I needed proof, because if I didn't have that, I'd have nothing left but the ashes of a life built on lies. After the realization hit, something inside me shifted. It was like a wall caved in, and behind it, the floodwaters of suspicion rushed forward. I couldn't look at Sarah the same way. Everything she said, every movement felt calculated, empty. I needed answers, needed to confirm what I already knew but refused to accept. But finding the truth meant playing a game I wasn't used to, one that required me to be observant, controlled. I had to act like nothing had changed, to play my part. Smile, nod, and pretend I didn't know she was slipping through my fingers like sand. I started with our circle, friends, family. Over the next few days, I reached out, subtly probing, casual conversations, carefully placed questions. But each time I pressed for information, I was met with either puzzled looks or deflection. No one had seen her acting any differently. No one had noticed the missing pieces of our life. Or maybe they were just as good at pretending as I was. The conversations felt like a loop, circling back to the same uneasy silence. And each time, I left more frustrated. What was I hoping to find? That someone else would confirm my suspicions so I didn't have to face them alone? It was naive, weak. If I wanted the truth, I had to do this myself. So I started keeping track of her movements. Sarah always had a routine: gym, brunch with friends, the occasional work meeting that stretched long into the evening. I never thought twice about it before, never questioned her. But now, every time she left the house, I found myself tense, waiting for the inevitable lie. I followed her a few times, my heart racing as I trailed behind her car at a safe distance. It felt surreal, like I was an intruder in someone else's life, watching through a lens that was growing darker with each passing day. But the more I followed, the less I understood. Sarah never went where she said she was going. Instead of brunch, she'd drive to a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe, sit alone for hours staring at her phone. And those work meetings, they were anything but. She'd vanish for hours, only to reappear looking slightly disheveled, the hint of a smile still lingering on her lips. It was maddening. And I still didn't have the proof I needed. The final straw came one night when she told me she was heading to the gym. "Don't wait up," she said casually, throwing a gym bag over her shoulder. I nodded, forcing a smile. As soon as she was out the door, I grabbed my keys and followed her. She didn't go to the gym. Instead, she drove to a quiet residential street on the other side of town and parked outside a nondescript house. I watched as she got out, glanced around as if checking to see if she was being followed, then walked up to the door. The man who answered was tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile that spread across his face as soon as he saw her. He pulled her inside, their silhouettes framed briefly in the doorway before it closed behind them. I sat there in the darkness, my hands clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles white. It felt like a slap across the face. There was no more denying it, no more clinging to the hope that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. Sarah was cheating, and she didn't even have the decency to hide it. But confronting her then would have been pointless. She'd deny it, spin it, make me feel like the paranoid husband who was seeing things that weren't there. I needed more than this. I needed hard evidence, something undeniable, something that would force her to tell me the truth. I went home that night, hollowed out, but with a new sense of purpose. The next morning I left for work as usual, only to double back once I was sure she'd left. I searched every corner of the house, going through her things with a meticulousness I'd never thought myself capable of. I found nothing. No letters, no hidden messages, nothing to explain who that man was or what he meant to her. Until I opened the glove compartment of her car, there it was, a sleek black phone, one I'd never seen before. It sat there like a coiled snake, daring me to pick it up. My hands shook as I turned it on, waiting for the screen to light up. No password, just a cascade of notifications, missed calls, unread texts, pictures. The messages told a story I didn't want to read. They were explicit, filled with longing and lust. And they weren't directed at me. It was him. The man from the house. He had a name, Tyler, and he wasn't just a fling. He was her escape, her alternate reality. As I scrolled through the pictures, her smiling, laughing, looking more alive than she'd ever seemed with me, something inside me cracked. It was like watching a version of Sarah I didn't recognize, a stranger wrapped in my wife's skin. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the phone, willing it all to be some twisted dream. But it wasn't. And the realization that she'd not only betrayed me but built an entire life around that betrayal was like a knife twisting in my gut. I should have confronted her right then, driven to wherever she was and thrown the phone in her face. But I didn't. There was a sick satisfaction in knowing what she thought she was hiding, in holding that power over her, even if it was only for a little while. So I put the phone back exactly where I found it and waited for her to come home. When she walked through the door that evening, smiling like everything was perfectly fine, I almost laughed. She had no idea. No idea that I knew everything, that her lies were unraveling. She kissed me on the cheek, asked me how my day was. And I played along, forcing my lips to stretch into a semblance of a smile, responding with the same bland pleasantries we'd been exchanging for months. It was a performance, a charade, but one I intended to keep up until I was ready to strike. In the days that followed, I became methodical. I made copies of everything, her texts, the pictures, every incriminating detail. I started documenting her movements, building a timeline of her deceit. I wasn't just some wronged husband seeking closure. I was building a case. And every new piece of information I uncovered was like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. The emotional toll was crushing. Every smile she gave me felt like acid on my skin. Every touch, a reminder of what she'd given to someone else. But I didn't let it show. I couldn't. I knew Sarah too well. The moment she sensed something was off, she'd shut down, go on the defensive. And I wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not yet. The more I learned, the more I realized just how deeply her lies ran. Tyler wasn't just some random guy. He was her coworker, someone I'd met at one of her office parties, shaken hands with. He'd looked me in the eye and smiled, all the while knowing he was sleeping with my wife. The realization made me sick. How many people knew? How many of them had seen me as the pathetic husband, blissfully unaware of the joke that was my life? The rage simmered beneath the surface, a constant boiling presence. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the ways I could destroy her. But revenge for the sake of revenge wasn't enough. I didn't just want to hurt her. I wanted her to feel what I felt, to have everything she thought she controlled ripped away from her. The night I discovered the second phone, I knew it was time. No more waiting, no more gathering evidence. I had enough. It was time to make her face the truth. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I needed time to process what I was about to do. I spent the day in our empty house, surrounded by the remnants of a life I no longer recognized. I stared at the wedding photos on the mantle, the smiling faces frozen in a happiness that felt like a distant memory. By evening, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me anymore. I wasn't going to let her keep pretending. If she thought she could keep playing both sides, she was wrong. It was time for Sarah to learn what it felt like to be the one caught off guard. When she came home that night, I was ready. "Hey, Sarah," I said softly, standing by the door as she slipped off her shoes. She looked up, surprised by my tone. "Yeah?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the phone, her phone, holding it up for her to see. "We need to talk." Sarah's eyes widened when I held up the phone, but she quickly masked her surprise with a tight smile. "What's that?" she asked, feigning ignorance. Her voice wavered just enough to betray her. "It's your phone, Sarah, the one you thought I'd never find," I replied, my voice steady, calm. I'd practiced this moment 1,000 times in my head, rehearsing every word, every intonation. "We both know what's on here, so don't bother lying." She stepped back, hands trembling as she pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't know what you're talking about." I almost laughed at how predictable she was, how easy it was to see through her now. "I've read every message, seen every picture. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know." Her gaze flickered toward the door, as if considering bolting, but she stayed rooted in place, struggling to find words. "Andrew, Save it," I cut her off sharply, feeling the familiar surge of anger bubbling up again. But I kept it contained, controlled. I'd learned to do that over the past few weeks, to compartmentalize my emotions until I needed them. "I'm not here to hear your excuses or explanations. I just want you to understand something. You've lost. Whatever game you were playing, it's over." She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to silence her. "I'm not going to make a scene. I'm not going to scream or throw things or do anything dramatic like that. You're not worth that kind of reaction, Sarah." I lowered the phone, slipping it back into my pocket. "But I want you to know, I'm not going to let this slide. I'm going to make sure you feel everything you put me through. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Her face crumpled, the mask finally slipping. "Andrew, please, you have to understand." I shook my head, the pity I'd once felt for her vanishing like smoke. "No, Sarah, you're the one who needs to understand. You've been lying and cheating, tearing apart everything we built. But you didn't just betray me, you manipulated me, made me question my own sanity." I took a step closer, lowering my voice to a hiss. "You thought you were smart, thought you could keep me in the dark, but you were careless. And now I'm going to make sure you pay for it." She took a shaky breath, and I watched as tears welled up in her eyes. I made mistakes, okay? I know that. But please, we can talk about this, work through it. There's nothing to work through, I interrupted coldly. You're not the woman I thought I married. And you know what? That's fine, but I'm not going to let you walk away from this like nothing happened. Her expression shifted, a flash of something hard, almost defiant, crossing her face. So what are you going to do, ruin me? Destroy everything just because you're hurt? I smiled then, a tight, humorless smile. No, Sarah, you ruined yourself. I'm just going to make sure the rest of the world sees it. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the entryway, stunned and speechless. It was only the beginning, but I needed space to think, to process. My heart was still pounding as I got into the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The anger, the betrayal, it was all there swirling like a storm inside me. But beneath it, there was a grim satisfaction. I'd finally made my decision. I wasn't going to let Sarah get away with what she'd done, but I needed a plan, a real plan. Not just for revenge, but for exposing her for the fraud she was. Back at home, I locked myself in the study and spread out everything I had, copies of her texts, the pictures, the hotel receipts. I'd been so focused on gathering information, on getting proof, that I hadn't thought much about what to do with it. Now, staring at the mess of evidence in front of me, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation or a dramatic scene. It needed to be more. Sarah's deceit ran deeper than I'd initially thought. Tyler wasn't just some random guy. He was intertwined with her life, the man she turned to when she walked out on me. And who knew how many others there were? How many more lies she'd spun? I realized I couldn't act on impulse. Sarah would twist any rash move I made against me. She was cunning, but I could be smarter. I needed to destroy her where it hurt the most, her sense of control. I spent hours planning, sketching out different scenarios. I needed to expose her not just to me, but to everyone she'd conned. But first, I had to know more. I needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal. So I started reaching out, discreetly, of course. It wasn't hard to find the cracks in Sarah's carefully constructed facade. A few anonymous emails to people who'd been at those office parties. A conversation with a neighbor who'd seen her come and go at odd hours. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Then I made a discovery that shifted everything. While going through her financial records, I noticed several unexplained transactions, large sums of money being transferred to unfamiliar accounts. Curious, I dug deeper. What I found left me cold. Sarah had been siphoning money from our accounts for months, sending it to what appeared to be a network of men, names I didn't recognize. But the pattern was clear. She wasn't just cheating. She was using these men, manipulating them into providing her with money, gifts, support. I realized with a sickening jolt that Tyler was only one piece of a larger scheme. She had other victims, men she'd seduced and conned just like she'd done to me. For a moment, I felt paralyzed by the enormity of it. This wasn't just infidelity, it was calculated, premeditated fraud. Sarah had built a web of deceit, and I'd only been a small part of it. But then the paralysis broke, replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. If she thought she could juggle multiple lives, I'd bring them all crashing down around her. My first step was to find these men. I started by tracing the names linked to the transactions, cross-referencing them with any contact information I could find. It was tedious work, but methodical, something I could lose myself in, a distraction from the pain. I crafted a carefully worded message, posing as someone who'd recently discovered Sarah's deceit. I didn't reveal everything, just enough to pique their curiosity, to make them question her. I kept it anonymous, signing off with only an initial and a vague promise of more information if they were willing to talk. The responses trickled in slowly at first. A few were skeptical, dismissive, but then I got a reply that made everything feel real. "Who the hell are you?" The message read. "And how do you know about Sarah?" It was from a man named Greg, one of the names linked to Sarah's accounts. His tone was defensive, angry, but also desperate. He knew something was wrong but hadn't been able to put his finger on it. I responded cautiously, revealing only what I needed to. I mentioned Tyler, how I'd found out about him. I hinted at there being more. Other men like Greg. I could almost feel his shock through the screen as he replied, asking for proof, demanding answers. I gave him just enough to confirm his worst fears. And once the floodgates opened, Greg poured out everything he knew. He'd been seeing Sarah for over a year, had even talked about leaving his own wife for her. He'd lent her money, thousands of dollars, because she'd spun some sob story about debt, about me being financially abusive. I felt sick reading his messages, but I forced myself to keep going. I needed his story. I needed all their stories. Over the next few days, I made contact with two more men, both of them echoing the same tales of manipulation, betrayal. Sarah had painted me as the villain in each scenario, using it as leverage to worm her way into their lives. With every new detail, my anger grew. She'd been playing us all, but the more I uncovered, the more I realized I couldn't do this alone. I needed allies, men who were as angry, as betrayed as I was, men who wanted to see Sarah exposed. So I started crafting a narrative, one that would turn Sarah's lies against her. I framed myself as just another victim, caught in her web. I appealed to their sense of justice, of revenge. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to agree. It wasn't easy. Some were reluctant, still clinging to the lies she'd fed them. But one by one, they came around. By the time I'd gathered enough support, I had a small army of men who wanted Sarah to pay. We coordinated, shared information. They provided me with the final pieces of the puzzle, proof that Sarah had scammed them, evidence that could be used against her. It wasn't just about exposing her anymore. It was about justice, about reclaiming the power she'd stolen from us. With every new ally, my plan solidified. I wasn't just going to bring Sarah down. I was going to dismantle her entire life, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for her to hold on to. The stage was set. All that was left was to make the first move. The first domino fell on a Thursday afternoon. I'd been waiting, watching, biding my time until the moment was right. I didn't need to make any grand moves. Sarah's web of lies was fragile, a house of cards ready to collapse. All it took was a nudge in the right places. I sent an anonymous message to Tyler, the man Sarah had been seeing behind my back. In it, I attached a few screenshots of her conversations with Greg. Nothing too damning, just enough to plant the seed of doubt. I kept the language vague, signed off with a simple, "You should know the truth," and hit send. Within an hour, I got my response. "What is this? Who are you?" It was almost too easy. I typed back a reply, keeping it curt, the tone detached. Someone who thought they were the only one. Then I went silent, watching as the panic unfolded in real time. Tyler's messages went from anger to disbelief to a sickening realization. He'd asked me for details, demand explanations, but I stayed mute, leaving him to stew in his paranoia. Because that's what I needed, to let him unravel on his own, just like I had. I knew that eventually he'd go to Sarah, confront her with the little bits I'd shown him. It was the first crack in her armor, and it worked. That evening, Sarah came home later than usual, her face drawn and tense. I glanced at her, kept my expression neutral. "Rough day?" She didn't answer, just brushed past me into the kitchen. I followed, leaning casually against the counter as she poured herself a glass of wine, her hand trembling slightly. She gulped it down in one go, then refilled. "What's going on?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "You seem on edge." Her eyes flicked to mine, narrowing with suspicion. "Nothing, just work stress." I almost laughed. Work stress? After everything I knew, that excuse seemed laughably inadequate. But I nodded sympathetically, played the part of the clueless husband. She drained her second glass and muttered something about needing to go to bed early. I let her go. After all, I didn't need her to break down now. I wanted her to slowly feel the pressure build, to watch her world close in on her. Tyler's anger was only the beginning. The next day, I sent a similar message to Greg. This time, I hinted at Tyler's involvement. A few well-placed screenshots of Sarah and Tyler's conversations, intimate pictures, plans to meet up. Greg's response was instant, filled with rage and confusion. "Who is this guy? Are you telling me Sarah's been cheating on me too?" I didn't reply. I wanted him to sit with the knowledge, to feel the same disgust and fury that had driven me to the edge. When men feel betrayed, when they know they've been played for fools, they act. It's only a matter of time before that anger turns outward. Sure enough, by the end of the week, Sarah's phone was blowing up with messages. I watched from a distance as she scrambled to keep control, her fingers tapping furiously on her screen. Her face twisted with frustration, her voice tight whenever she answered the calls, her attempts at soothing both men obviously failing. I didn't need to listen to know what was happening. They were confronting her, demanding explanations, and she was desperately trying to keep the lies from collapsing. I spent the next few days setting more traps, laying out small breadcrumbs for other men to find. I didn't need to expose everything at once. I wanted them to come to their own conclusions. Each man I contacted reacted with disbelief, then anger, and finally with a determination to get back at her. It was a slow burn, watching as they started to communicate with each other, each new revelation adding weight to the avalanche that was building. Soon the men began talking to one another, connecting the dots. I stayed in the background, just a ghostly presence feeding the fire, guiding them without ever stepping into the spotlight. Sarah knew something was off. She became more skittish, snapping at me for the slightest reasons, her eyes constantly darting to her phone as if expecting another blow. She started making calls in whispered tones, her voice strained and pleading. The fear in her eyes was growing day by day, and I savored every second of it. Then she made a critical mistake. One night, after another tense silence over dinner, she came to me, her face pale and drawn. "Andrew, I need to talk to you." I raised an eyebrow, masking my satisfaction. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. I've made some mistakes. I know I've been distant lately, but it's because I've been dealing with some personal issues." Her voice wavered, the tears starting to brim at the edges of her eyes. I need some time. Can you give me that?" Time, it was almost comical. She was asking me for patience, for understanding, as if she hadn't shattered every ounce of trust between us. I took a deep breath, pretended to think it over. "Of course," I said softly. "Take as much time as you need." She gave me a shaky smile, relief flooding her features. She had no idea. No idea that this was exactly what I wanted. To lull her into a false sense of security, to make her believe I was on her side even as I tightened the noose around her neck. That weekend, I pulled the final string. I had one last conversation with Greg. By now, he and the other men were furious, plotting their own form of retribution. I knew I had to control the narrative or it could spiral out of my hands. So I positioned myself as the orchestrator, the man who'd put the pieces together, the one who had the full story. "Meet me," I said to him over the phone. "I'll show you everything. Bring the others." We met in a small, nondescript cafe on the outskirts of town. Greg arrived first, his face tight with barely suppressed rage. Then Tyler walked in, looking haunted, broken. A few more men trickled in, each carrying the same expression of betrayal and anger. I laid it all out for them, the money trails, the messages, the pictures. I showed them just how deep Sarah's deceit went, how she'd used each of them to her own advantage. By the end of my presentation, there was a stunned silence. "She has to pay for this," Tyler muttered, his voice shaking. "She will," I assured him, "but we have to be smart about it. This isn't just about revenge. We need to make sure she can't do this to anyone else." "What are you suggesting?" Greg asked warily. I leaned forward, my voice low. "We take everything to the authorities. All of it, every piece of evidence. We expose her for what she is, a fraud, a con artist. We file reports, press charges, and we make sure she can't weasel her way out." There was a murmur of agreement, a few nods. The men looked at each other, then back at me, their expressions hardening with resolve. It was the final step, the culmination of weeks of planning. Once we had enough backing, We went to the police, handed over everything. The financial records, the testimonies, the proof of her manipulations. It was enough to make any defense lawyer sweat. Sarah was summoned for questioning the next day. I made sure to be out of the house when the police came, watched from a distance as they escorted her into a squad car. She looked bewildered, terrified, her eyes darting around as if searching for some escape. There was no escape now. In the following days, as the legal machine ground into motion, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I'd expected to feel triumphant, victorious. But instead, there was a hollow sort of satisfaction, the kind that comes not from joy, but from knowing that justice, however twisted, had been served. Sarah was charged with fraud, theft, and emotional manipulation. The police uncovered even more victims, her network of deceit stretching further than any of us had imagined. Every new revelation only tightened the trap around her, leaving her with no room to maneuver. By the time her trial began, she was a shadow of the woman she'd once been, pale, thin, the defiance gone from her eyes. I sat in the courtroom, watched as she tried to plead her case, her voice breaking under the weight of the evidence stacked against her. She glanced at me once, her gaze pleading, but I looked away. This was what she deserved. When the guilty verdict was read, there was no sense of elation, no feeling of victory, just a quiet, somber acceptance. I'd done what I set out to do. I'd made sure she couldn't hurt anyone else. But in doing so, I'd closed the door on everything we'd once been. Sarah was sentenced to 14 years. As they led her away in handcuffs, I stood up and left, not bothering to look back. Outside, I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs. It was over. Finally, truly over. And for the first time in months, I felt free. Not happy, not whole, but free. The confrontation took place at the site of Sarah's first betrayal, our old house. The place we had shared, now empty and hollow, reflecting the desolation that had settled in my chest. It was the one place where everything began to unravel for us, a symbolic battleground for the final confrontation. I chose it deliberately. I wanted her to face me here, where the ghost of our marriage still lingered in every corner, where the truth would hit her hardest. I waited in the dimly lit living room, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. I'd left the door slightly ajar, knowing she'd arrive with that familiar mix of arrogance and caution. I'd made sure the invitation was impossible to ignore, a simple message that would unnerve her to the core. I know everything. Meet me at the house. Alone. When I heard the creak of the front door, I tensed. My grip tightened around the manila envelope on the coffee table. Footsteps echoed through the hall, hesitant yet purposeful. She entered, looking paler and thinner than I remembered, her eyes darting around the room before landing on me. "Andrew?" She hesitated, licking her lips nervously. "What is this? Why are we here?" I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between us. I watched her fidget, saw the panic creeping into her expression as she took in the emptiness of the house, the bare walls, the absence of anything personal. It was a stark reminder that everything she had taken for granted was gone. "Sit," I said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from me. She glanced at it, then back at me, suspicion clouding her gaze. "I don't have time for this." "If you're trying to—" "Sit down, Sarah." My voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her comply. She perched on the edge of the chair, her back straight, shoulders tense. I let out a slow breath, carefully sliding the envelope across the table toward her. She eyed it warily, her fingers trembling as she reached for it. "What's this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Open it." She did, her hands fumbling as she pulled out the stack of documents. I watched as her eyes skimmed over the evidence I'd compiled, the bank statements showing money transfers to multiple accounts, the signed testimonies from the men she'd deceived, the records of her secret accounts. Every lie, every betrayal laid bare in black and white. Sarah's face blanched as she flipped through the pages, her breath hitching audibly. This is proof," I finished for her. "Proof that you didn't just betray me, but a dozen other men. Proof that you've been running a con for years, using each of us to fund your lifestyle." She dropped the papers onto the table as if they'd burned her. This is bullshit. You're twisting things. Am I? I leaned forward, my gaze locked onto hers. I spoke to them, Sarah. Greg, Tyler, David. Men who you led to believe they were special, that they mattered to you, men and you drained dry, then discarded like they were nothing. Her mouth opened and closed, panic flickering in her eyes. You don't understand. It wasn't like that. I had to save it. My voice cut through her protest like a blade. I'm done listening to your excuses. Do you even know the mess you've made? These men trusted you. I trusted you. And you tore us all apart. She shook her head frantically, her voice rising in desperation. I had no choice, Andrew. You, our life, it wasn't enough. I needed, what, money? Control? I let out a harsh laugh. Was I just another pawn to you? Another idiot to use and throw away? No, she cried, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It wasn't like that with you. I loved you. I still don't. I slammed my fist on the table, making her flinch. Don't you dare say that. You don't know the meaning of the word. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Then Sarah took a deep breath, her expression hardening. So what now? You've exposed me to them, humiliated me. Is this your big revenge, Andrew? Ruining my life? It's not about revenge, I said slowly. It's about making sure you can't do this again, to me or anyone else. Her eyes narrowed, calculating. And what makes you think I won't find a way out? I've always landed on my feet, always survived. I smiled then, a cold, empty smile that sent a shiver through her. That's the thing, Sarah. You've never faced consequences. You've always talked your way out, manipulated people, twisted the truth. But not this time. She opened her mouth to retort, but I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small voice recorder. I pressed play, and her voice filled the room, soft, pleading, the way she'd spoken to Greg when she'd swindled him out of thousands. Then Tyler, another recording of her spinning lies, promising love and a future she never intended to give. Each word was a dagger, cutting deeper into her defenses. By the time the last recording ended, Sarah's face was ashen, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I made sure they all had a copy, I said quietly, and I gave one to the police too. You can't do this, she stammered, her voice breaking. Andrew, please, I'll lose everything. My freedom, my life. You can't. Your freedom? I echoed, incredulous. You were willing to destroy lives without a second thought. Now you're worried about what you'll lose? Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I felt nothing. No pity, no regret, just a cold, detached finality. Andrew, I can fix this. We can fix this, she pleaded, leaning forward, reaching out as if to touch me. I made mistakes, but I can make it right. I'll pay them back. It's too late. I pulled away, standing up. They've already filed charges. And with everything I've handed over, they'll make sure you don't get out of this. Andrew, no, please. She stumbled to her feet, desperation clawing at her voice. Don't do this. Don't let them take me away. I'll lose everything. Please, I'm begging you. I looked at her then, really looked at her. The woman I'd once loved, reduced to a panicked mess, clinging to the last threads of her control. It should have made me feel powerful, triumphant, but all I felt was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. This is the last time we'll ever see each other, I said softly. After today, you're nothing to me. No, she screamed, lunging toward me, her hands reaching for my shirt. I stepped back, letting her stumble and fall to the floor. Please don't leave me like this. I can change, You don't get it, Sarah, I'm not leaving you. I glanced at my watch, then at the door. They're coming to take you away. Right on cue, there was a heavy knock on the door. Sarah froze, her face going stark white. The panic turned to sheer terror as she realized what was happening. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from the sound. Andrew, no, you can't do this to me. I'm your wife. You can't let them. They're not here because of me, I said quietly. They're here because of what you did. The door swung open, two officers stepping inside. Sarah's gaze darted to me, then back to them, her face twisted with disbelief. They approached slowly, speaking in calm, measured tones, but she backed away, shaking her head frantically. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," one of them said, his voice firm but gentle. "No, I didn't. This isn't—" She turned to me, eyes wild. "Andrew, help me. Tell them this is all a mistake. Please, I'm begging you." I met her gaze, held it for a long moment, then I turned away. "Andrew!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Andrew, please, don't let them—" The officers moved in, one grabbing her arm as she struggled, kicking and screaming. I stood there, unmoving as they read her rights, cuffed her hands behind her back. Her cries echoed through the empty house, raw and desperate, but I felt nothing. "Andrew, don't leave me like this, please." Her voice faded as they led her outside, into the waiting squad car. I followed at a distance, watching as they placed her inside, the door slamming shut with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. It was done. Over. She looked back at me through the window, her face pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her cheeks. I stared at her, the hollow ache in my chest spreading. Then I turned and walked away. Sarah was gone. The door to our past was closed, sealed forever. I should have felt something, relief, closure, satisfaction. But all I felt was an overwhelming emptiness, the kind that comes when the battle is won, but at too great a price. I'd set out to destroy her, and I had, but in doing so, I destroyed something in myself too. The aftermath of Sarah's arrest played out like a slow-motion car crash, surreal and inevitable. The trial spanned months, every detail of her double life exposed under the unrelenting scrutiny of the court. Victims paraded in and out of the witness stand, each man's story compounding the evidence against her until the weight of it was too much for even the most sympathetic juror to ignore. When the guilty verdict was announced, there were no cries of outrage, no dramatic outbursts, just a low murmur of approval, like a collective exhalation of breath held too long. She was sentenced to 14 years. The judge's gavel fell with a resounding crack that signaled the end of Sarah's reign of deceit. But instead of feeling triumphant, I found myself standing outside the courthouse, staring blankly at the sky. She was gone, stripped of her freedom, her influence. So why did I still feel like I was the one who'd lost? I sold the house a week later. Every room was saturated with memories I no longer wanted to revisit. Echoes of arguments, the hollow laughter of a marriage that had been a lie. Moving felt necessary, a way to sever ties with a life that wasn't mine anymore. I needed distance, both physical and emotional, from everything we had shared. I settled in a small, quiet town upstate. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I rented a modest two-bedroom house at the edge of town. It had a small yard out back, lined with the remnants of an old garden that had long since grown wild and tangled. I liked the place for its anonymity. There was no history here, no painful associations, just empty space and a chance to start over. I took a job at a local architecture firm. Nothing as demanding or high-profile as before, just small projects, designing homes for people I didn't have to pretend to like. It felt good, getting back to the basics, drawing clean lines, erecting solid foundations, creating something stable, something real. Days bled into weeks, then months. The sharp edges of my anger dulled, replaced by a strange, muted clarity. I threw myself into work, rebuilding relationships with friends I'd neglected, reconnecting with family I'd pushed away. They'd heard whispers of what happened, but I kept my explanations brief. I wasn't interested in rehashing the past. It felt like trying to describe a nightmare that had faded, the details slipping away like smoke. But there were still nights when sleep eluded me, when I'd lie awake, the darkness pressing down, and think about her. The way she'd looked at me in those final moments, desperate, pleading, as if she still believed she could pull me back into her orbit, It wasn't love, whatever twisted bond had existed between us. It was something darker, something that had infected us both and left me hollowed out, stripped of the man I used to be. I'd thought bringing her down would bring closure. But closure was an illusion, a fantasy for people who hadn't seen what I'd seen, who hadn't experienced betrayal so deep, it altered the core of who they were. There would never be a tidy end, no satisfying resolution. Just the raw, ugly truth of it. I'd fought back, I'd won, but I hadn't really escaped. One evening, months after the trial, I stood in the backyard, staring at the wild tangle of the old garden. The sun was setting, casting a warm amber glow over everything, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a stirring of something close to peace. I took a deep breath and made a decision. I drove to the local nursery the next day and bought a sapling, a young oak, strong and resilient. The kind that would grow for decades, its roots burrowing deep into the earth. I spent the afternoon clearing a spot in the yard, digging into the soil until my hands were sore, sweat soaking through my shirt. I planted the sapling carefully, patting the earth around it until it stood firm and steady. Then I stepped back and looked at it. A fragile thing now, but one that would grow tall and unyielding. It was a symbol, I realized, of what I wasn't entirely sure, maybe of new beginnings. Or maybe of endurance, of the strength to keep standing even when the storms hit. I crouched down, brushing my fingers over the delicate leaves. "I'll be here," I murmured softly, "watching you grow. You'll get stronger. I'll make sure of it." It felt absurd talking to a tree. But there was something comforting in it, something that made the tight knot in my chest ease a little. I straightened, brushing dirt from my hands, and went back inside. The next few weeks passed quietly. I developed a routine: work, home, checking on the sapling. It became a small ritual, a way of marking the days, of seeing tangible progress. I trimmed the wild hedges, cleared out the old garden beds, planted a few flowers. Slowly, the yard began to take shape, transforming from a neglected plot into something vibrant and full of potential. The sapling grew, its roots digging deeper, its branches spreading, and with each inch it gained, I felt something inside me shifting too. It wasn't a grand revelation, not some sudden epiphany that washed away the pain. But it was a start, a sign that I was capable of creating again, of nurturing something rather than destroying it. The past still lingered, a shadow that sometimes crept in when I least expected it. I'd see a flicker of her in a stranger's smile, hear the echo of her voice in a passing conversation, and for a moment the old ache would flare up. But it was different now, less consuming. I could acknowledge it, let it pass, and then move on. One afternoon, as I stood by the oak, admiring the way it swayed gently in the breeze, I heard a soft rustle behind me. I turned to find my neighbor, an elderly woman I'd exchanged pleasantries with a few times, standing by the fence. "Looks like you've been busy," she said, nodding toward the yard. I smiled, wiping my hands on my jeans, just trying to bring a little life back to the place. She leaned against the fence, her gaze thoughtful. "You've done more than that. This place, it feels different." Lighter. I glanced around, seeing the yard through her eyes. The neat rows of flowers, the freshly mowed lawn, the sapling standing tall and proud. "Yeah," I murmured. "I guess it does." She watched me for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You know, my late husband used to say that planting a tree is an act of hope, something that takes years to grow but lasts long after we're gone. It's a way of believing in the future." I looked at the oak, its leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Hope. Maybe that was what this was. A small, quiet act of hope for something better, something more than the wreckage Sarah had left behind. "Thank you," I said quietly. She smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. "You take care now, and don't forget, trees need time and patience." Just like people. I nodded, watching as she turned and shuffled back to her house. When I looked back at the sapling, something inside me loosened. The tightness I'd carried for so long finally easing. Time and patience. I'd been so consumed with revenge, with tearing Sarah down, that I hadn't thought about what came after. But standing here now in this quiet, peaceful place, I realized that maybe I had a chance to grow, to rebuild, to become someone stronger and better than before. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. I turned away from the tree and looked toward the house, feeling the weight of the past lift just a little. One day at a time, I told myself, one step at a time. And so with a deep breath and a cautious smile, I took that first step, away from the shadows of what had been and toward the light of what could be.